you to do it. Since we are in this mode of communication, I'm going to use some PowerPoint to aid the conversation. And let me just see if it's able to do that from my end. Let me know if it's working. Give me a minute. Can you see it? Awesome. Can you hear me well too? Great. So Safe Spaces at Daybreak, my story toward LGBT inclusion. Awakened by my desire to live a life of love, sacrifice is part of what I offer to enter the experience of knowing God, whose very character is love. Again, thank you for having me today. I bring you greetings from the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland, and in Tampa. I'm currently doing my postdoctoral residency as a health psychologist in rehabilitation medicine and skilled nursing here in these facilities. So Clara is my former house leader, whom I consider one of my many friends at Daybreak. So she showed up on my FB page. So I invited her to be a friend in FB. It's not that FB becomes the final rule of who's friend and who's not. I saw her during, I think it was in Lyra's page, who's also a former assistant at Greenhouse, who's here in our group today, and who has really become more of a sister through the years. So it's good to do this conversation knowing that I'm among friends. And this is a topic that's not always very easy to talk about. And when I will be sharing this with you, really, I can feel my heart pounding, but at the same time, knowing that it's a gift to you, and for us to be able to journey together towards this kind of posturing where we are able to listen to one another. So Clara reached out and called me. We exchanged greetings, and then I updated her on where I was in my life's journey. So I wanted to share with you some snippets of that conversation with her that morning. So Clara said, "Oruel, last June, the Greenhouse celebrated the Pride Month. When the team introduced the idea to the core members in the house, David Harmon initially resisted. He asked, 'What is this Pride thing all about?' When Tomic clarified that Ruel, his friend, is a gay person and we want to celebrate him, David said, 'Okay, yes, let's do it.' Our intention as a community is to be able to provide a safe space for both core members and assistants, making sure that they are in a safe space once they are in the community. It is an extension of the community, and our life is an extension of our values, of who we are. It has been a complicated conversation in our community. We thought of reaching out to you, Ruel, because you came out here at Daybreak, and because of this, you're able to live your life authentically today. So how do you really say no to that? But part of me was really excited when Clara said that. So I responded to Clara with this. Clara, I have two reasons for wanting to reach out to you first. But first, I'd like to ask you, to partner with me in prayer as I write. There's some writing projects on what it means to be an XX gay story. And so a significant part of that story has been part of my journey through L'Arche and coming out together of faith at the intersections of gender and sexuality. Henry Nouwen, a theologian and a former pastor at Daybreak, introduced to me the community when I was training in a seminary in the Philippines in the 90s. He helped me stay close to the heart of Jesus. Let me show you a little bit of what Philippines is. That's where I lived, in an island there. So Henry helped me stay close to the heart of Jesus as I navigated the different church and political histories taking place in the Western culture of that time in the 80s, where gay rights movement was coming up, and then just it was huge in America. And so and knowing the context of the Philippines, it being just like cut and paste theologies from the West and transfer it there in the Philippines. That's how it looked like, at least at the time. And secondly, which I did not get to do, was to invite Clara and others who were with me at Daybreak at that time to be readers of what I was writing. So this writing project around conversations, about conversations with Henry, about how to stay faithful to Christ and the mission while considering where the Spirit may be calling us to respond to the current times, especially around conversations on sexuality. So Clara invited me not so much to speak about concepts, but rather to share. She said this very clearly, not so much concepts, but your story. And started the starting point of that story to give guidance, to help formulate some of the questions for conversations after this reflection. So I move forward to share my story, conscious of what the committee intends to do during this time of listening, in a posture, hopefully, of a listening prayer. As a caveat, I will be mentioning names, and many of them are really here in this conversation. But I've removed the names where I did not ask permission. If there is one thing that we learn from this COVID pandemic, it is that we have a shared humanity as citizens of one global village who want to be there for each other. Our virtual presence is a tangible expression that, after all, we are all in this, and together we will live. So I want to be respectful of the privacy of people, but when we delve around conversations of faith and sexuality, it requires a level of honesty which we are not so used to. I thought the West is very open about it, coming from the East, but no. Sexuality is not something we publicly talk about very easily. But if there is one beautiful thing that I have learned about living in honesty and authenticity on matters of sexuality and spirituality, it is how these two are closely linked in human and divine experience. So I'm going to bring our memory and journey with me back in time, one Monday house meetings with assistants, sometime in 2014, maybe April, because we sat outside the Cedars. So maybe it's a little bit hotter at that time, maybe May. Members present: Clara Facchetti, Ann Todd, Lyra Jano, Matt Kovich, Josh Cameron, and of course myself. Location: the Cedars. So Monday house meetings at the greenhouse always began with the usual ordinary weekly personal check-ins, guided by the house leader's question: what has been your highlight or maybe low points of the week? I took my turn to share like everyone else. After we went around the circle, we debriefed. I remember Anne recounting the question running in her head while I was talking. And Anne Todd said, "Did Ruel just come out as a gay person, a gay man during the sharing?" And I responded to Anne saying, "Yes, Anne, I did. I wanted to remain as ordinary as possible, guided by the large value of seeing the sacredness hidden in the ordinary life. I felt safe in the company of my fellow assistants who had also become my friends. In this caring circle of assistants with perhaps different forms of hidden disabilities, It became a caring circle of safety for me that helped me to integrate the different parts of myself in to live authentically in honesty at the community level. Because my one rule of life is honesty is always the beginning of relationship with God. So I want to believe that any growth in spirituality begins with honesty. Honesty is the foundation of this relationship. I have always wanted to be honest about myself with God because honesty is foundational to spiritual growth. Community is God's way of revealing reality as an invitation to live in a life of honesty in relationship to that community. It's a way of claiming God to be with us and among us. So sharing the truth about myself was a way of testing this reality of God and a way of testing that community that claims to live for God and testify that God is among us. I took that risk because I thought, there was the risk of feeling rejected or being labeled or being judged. There's prejudices around it. This is a very common, not common, but very special gift that reminds me always. It was the gift painted by Joey, and that was the gift of the greenhouse today of that day when I completed my time at the greenhouse. And that encompasses so many memories. I may not be a Henry Nouwen who reflected so beautifully in his writings about how the community held him when he had a nervous breakdown because of his unrequited love. Henry, the psychology-trained priest, the author of and Harvard and Yale professor, etc. It is a little bit pompous to compare myself as an assistant with Henry, but it is precisely because I always go back to him, because the mission of L'Arche that Henry, had to strip himself of all that would not allow him to be honest with his humanity, that would allow him to be honest with his humanity, whether it was institutional, societal, or structural cultures of the external world that hindered him from becoming more honest. It took a community like Daybreak to produce a Henry. So has Daybreak completed its mission because it has made space for a person like Henry? Or is it open to welcome other future Henrys? Yes, future men, women, assistants, core members who need to come home to relationships of safety here at Daybreak, because honesty is the foundation of growth in knowing God. So I remember one morning during the anniversary of Henry's death, Sister Sue Masteller was asked to introduce and describe Henry in her words. I listened carefully and intently to her language. This is what she said, and I quote, "Henry was a very sensitive man with a lot of needs for affection," end of quote. Reflecting on Sue's words, she was very respectful of Henry. Perhaps she wanted to be faithful to Henry's language of how he understood himself within the context of his time, structure, institution, person, among many others. Was Sue true to her words about Henry? Yes. How would it have sounded if Sue had said, Henry was a gay man? Would she still have remained faithful and relevant to the story of Henry in her attempt to be faithful to Henry and faithful to the call of Daybreak and its mission to call the LGBTQ plus assistants, core members to find their home at Daybreak like Henry, to address the suffering of LGBT men and women and youth today? Where in context, there are more than 50% of suicides among youth that come from the LGBT plus community, where 50% plus of homeless and street youth come from the same community, where 36 members of trans women in Brazil are murdered daily, We can stay poetic, subtle, nice in our language, where we leave the subtleties of the LGBTQ plus in our conversations, in Henry's books, the stories between assistants, about assistants, our community leaders, etc. They can stay within the confines of our community as part of saying faithful to our stories. Or we become intentional to engage in a current conversation as a way of posturing to put into words our intention, our prayer, as an active response to the current signs of the times. The next memory I want to share is a vignette with a core member after a behavioral escalation in 2016. One of the core members struggles in his behavioral escalations of aggressive behaviors. One of the ways to support him was our afternoon walks. He would go for our walks to the nearby park behind the cedars. That's not exactly the view of the cedar, but just the symbolism of what it means to sit together in conversation with each other. Our conversations explored stories around our sexuality. That's how we grew deeper in our friendship. I asked him about his feelings for other men because I knew his story. I could not quote exactly what he said, but I remember how he said it. He could only go as far as to acknowledge his liking for other men. Then he became quiet. I gave him more time. I broke the long silence by asking him, "Brother, you are quiet. Is there anything else you want to tell me?" He responded with, "No, it is not right." Looking back now, I speak as an assistant. How would my friendship deepen with him if I was able to model for him as a gay person, a gay assistant, where I lived in honesty in the community, introducing him, for example, to my partner, my sacred companion, whom I have covenanted in love? Would he have been more honest with me instead of shut down our conversation by saying, "No, it is not right"? How much of what core members contain, the angst, yes, the anxieties of us assistants, and act out what we hide or suppress in ourselves as assistants? I had to process my own anger at the time, for the lack of community, to expand its dimensions, to go further with him in his story. He helped me during our anger. He helped me bring out my own anger and name it. I had anger in myself. I had anger with the community as a system. I was not ready to go back to the house yet at the time, to the greenhouse. So I resolved to myself that I would not go back to the greenhouse with my anger, because there would be more core members there, plus with assistants, plus the house routines. I was not ready. I invited him to our next routine for the afternoon, our walk to Tim Hortons. So Clara said to me, "Okay, use his card, but be very careful because there's not a lot in it." And so there was not much indeed in it, but it was enough to be able to buy a piece of chocolate chip and a Tim Horton chocolate drink. And so we sat there at Tim Hortons along Yonge and Yorkland. I was still angry. I did not want to talk to him. I wanted him to finish. Hopefully by the time he would finish his food, we would be able to leave. My feelings would subside. Remember, the context was a behavioral escalation, and I got hurt. So he showed me his chocolate drink, motioned to move it towards me because he wanted to share it with me. He lifted the chocolate chip. he lifted the chocolate chip cookie, brought it, broke it in front of me. And that moment, I had an epiphany. I was transported to the table and I was asked, Ruel, do you want to partake this bread with me? Will you stay with me during this time of inner turmoil? Will you share in my suffering? And perhaps looking back to it now, will you provide words for what I cannot articulate in words? Now I want to shift my reflection as a clinician in the mental health profession. Would we have helped that brother if we were able to reflect on our behavior in our behavior support plan under the section sexuality? His appreciation to explore same-sex expressions. We're no longer using the DSM-3, which is the manual for the classification of mental disorders. It has declassified same-sex attraction as a mental illness. So how much of the behavioral escalation is part of suppressed anxious feelings related to sexual energies that want to find its way for healthier channels and expression? I would accompany him to the regular visits to his psychiatrist. I was an observer of the science and the art of clinical case conceptualizations, to let science and the evidence contribute so that he could be helped effectively. Same-sex formulation as part of case conceptualization was not part of that conversation. Why is that? No one wanted to name it. What was ironic was that the assessment was conducted by a gay psychiatrist, assessing maybe a gay patient, accompanied by a gay assistant, that happens to be me, gay written all over, but no one named it. So is creating an LGBTQ safe space committee at Daybreak makes us become a little bit more intentional to name this as a valid human experience of core members so as to help them live their lives as integrated human beings in the society as a whole. But it's not just core members, it's easier with core members. It's harder for us, assistants and members of collective community. My contract with Daybreak as an assistant ended in 2016, but not my story. It continually to be nurtured. It nurtures my reflections during the 3-year stay within the community. Honesty around conversations and sexuality needs to be held in tenderness. I'm sharing with you the picture I have. You can see there my sacred companion, Bill, on the very last one, the very end. That was before my mother's death. He passed on 2 years ago on that in Richmond Hill, no, Vaughan. And it's important to be honest. It's important to be able to enter these birthing pains. And we had this conversation with the committee around to enter into that creative tension as we listen to each other in moving forward to nurture this conversation. We enter a creative tension brought about in that encounter of sharing our stories with each other and maybe our own sexualities. And if there's one thing I think that has the good thing that is being brought about by my own coming out is that also my other friends came out in their own way around their own stuff on their own sexualities. So we are invited to be in a posture of listening, which is being part of living in community. And so let me end with last two statements. And one of them is this: in the face of the oppressed, I recognize my own face. And in the hands of the oppressor, I recognize my own hands. Their flesh is my flesh. Their blood is my blood. Their pain is my pain. Their smile is my smile. Their ability to torture is in me too. Their capacity to forgive, I find also in myself. So when someone murders, I know that I too could have done that. But when someone gives birth, I know I'm capable of doing that as well. A quote from Henry Nouwen. And this is a picture on my 50th birthday that was celebrated on my 40th with fellow assistants. One is with Daniel, he's from Germany, was in the Newhouse? No, the other house. And then Tyler, who was with me at the greenhouse. And I had a coming out celebration during my birthday, right there in the meeting hall of Large Daybreak. So I am forever grateful for providing me that safe space that really became a sacred space for me so that I can integrate my faith at the intersections of gender and sexuality. Thank you.